It's Wednesday, the 9th of June 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Sean Aylmer. The Prime Minister calls for an overhaul of global trade rules as he ups the fight with China. That's our main story. Also coming up in today's podcast, business conditions hit record levels as the Federal Treasurer talks up Australia's economic outlook. The Federal Police work with global agencies to smash a massive guns and drug-running syndicate. And West Australia allows vaccines for younger citizens. Immediately after the podcast, stay listening for my chat to Carlos Cacho, Chief Economist at Jarden, about the labour market. But first, here's a brief look at markets. Wall Street was trading close to record levels overnight. The S&P 500 briefly passed its previous closing high, and in afternoon trading was up slightly. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was flat, while the Nasdaq was up 0.3%. European markets were higher, led by London's FTSE, which was up 0.3%, while the Stoxx Europe 600 was up 0.2%. The S&P ASX 200 closed 0.2% higher yesterday to finish at 7,293 points, not far off its record closing high of last week. Technology stocks bounced and did best among the different sectors, while materials stocks were the underperformers. 10 of the top 15 stocks ended in the red, which is unusual when the bourse rises. Fortescue Metals, BHP and Rio Tinto all ended about 1% lower. Among the large caps, accounting software group Xero was the best performer, up 1.4%. Brent crude jumped more than 1% overnight to be trading at $72 a barrel. Gold prices were down a touch. The Aussie dollar is trading at 77.4 US cents. And new research suggests about 4 million Australians are likely to purchase digital currencies in the next 12 months, including more than a third of millennials and almost as many Gen Zers. The survey, commissioned by a cryptocurrency exchange Kraken, said 21% of investors were ready to purchase digital tokens. It's a bit of a long bow to say that a survey of just over 1,000 people can suggest 4 million Australians will buy into cryptos, but it is interesting that millennials like the investment class more than others. Meanwhile, Bitcoin fell to a 2-week low overnight, dropping nearly 10% to be trading at $32,000 a unit. Other cryptocurrencies also fell. The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, will call for an overhaul of global trade rules as the best way to prevent China's incursion in the world, 24 hours before he leaves for the Group of Seven meeting in England. In a speech he is due to give in Western Australia later today, Mr Morrison will warn that the world is approaching a crossroads between liberal democracy and authoritarianism, and liberal democracies must work with the same commitment and common purpose as they did during the Cold War to preserve freedoms. One of the best ways to fight authoritarianism is to overhaul the World Trade Organization, including the restoration of the binding dispute resolution system, Mr Morrison will say, according to media reports. The risks of miscalculation and conflict are growing, and the technological edge enjoyed historically by Australia and its allies are under challenge. Mr Morrison will also call for more financing and capital for the Indo-Pacific region via the World Bank and Asian Development Bank, the building up of defence forces and security and trade partnerships, and safeguarding supply lines among like-minded countries. Finally, he'll back a recent call by US President Joe Biden to identify the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. The speech is among the most important the PM has given on foreign policy, and is sure to ingratiate himself with the US and other European nations and irritate China. Australia's success in fighting COVID provides Mr Morrison with some political capital as he heads to the G7, but Mr Morrison is upping the fight against the biggest bully and Australia's major trading partner in the region. In a moment, the rest of the news you need to know this morning. In overseas news, thousands of websites around the world went offline last night for about an hour, including several from major news outlets and streaming services, following problems with the Silicon Valley-based internet infrastructure provider. The group, Fastly, operates a content delivery network that helps facilitate faster loading times. It blamed a configuration error. The Group of Seven meeting this weekend will focus on pushing vaccines to countries that need them most. Both US President Joe Biden and British PM Boris Johnson are expected to rally behind plans to make more shots available to low-income countries. Meanwhile, 10 foreign ministers of Southeast Asian nations are meeting in China this week, with greater economic cooperation, vaccine passports, and security issues on the agenda. The face-to-face meetings come as Beijing works to solidify its position among its neighbours, following greater tensions with Washington, and the development of the Quad Group, which includes Australia, Japan, India, and the US. And French President Emmanuel Macron was slapped in the face overnight while on a walkabout in provincial France. 2 men were being detained following the incident, which included the men shouting the slogan, "Down with Macronism." How very French. Locally, the outlook for economic growth for the rest of the year has improved sharply after companies reported booming business conditions and signalled intentions to hire and invest more. The National Australia Bank survey of business conditions hit a record high in May for the second successive month. There's stronger activity across the states and territories and across most industries. The Business Conditions Survey suggests sectors such as construction and manufacturing are now moving from recovery into expansion mode, said NAB Chief Economist Alan Oster. Business invested more in May, and the survey suggests they'll spend even more this month. Until earlier this year, capital investment was the missing piece of the economic puzzle. It's critical to economic growth because the money is spent on equipment and hiring people. Meanwhile, Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenberg yesterday said there was now an historic opportunity to drive the unemployment rate lower. He said the forecast peak debt to GDP was a fraction of the US, UK and Japan, and higher iron ore prices than forecast in the budget could lift the bottom line by $12 billion. He was also relaxed about house prices, saying he was comfortable with people's number one asset rising in value. There was a touch of negative economic news yesterday. Westpac lifted its 2- and 3-year fixed-rate mortgages. Commonwealth Bank lifted some of its fixed rates last week. It's very, very early, but fixed-term rates are creeping higher. A joint Australian Federal Police FBI investigation, codenamed Operation Ironside, has seized hundreds of kilograms of drugs and illegal weapons worth $50 million and charged 224 people with more than 525 charges. More than 4,000 police officers were involved in the operation, and AFP Commissioner Rhys Kershaw said the alleged offenders included mafia, motorcycle gangs and Asian crime syndicates bringing guns and drugs into Australia on an industrial scale. The action shut down 6 clandestine laboratories and 21 threats to kill, including saving one family of 5, Mr Kershaw said. Prime Minister Scott Morrison applauded the efforts of the AFP, saying it had struck a heavy blow against organised crime in Australia and around the world. He said it was a watershed moment in the fight against organised crime. The Morrison government has set itself up for a fight against Labor and the union movement in the run-up to the next federal election by trying to introduce greenfield workplace agreements, which would be applicable to mining and other large infrastructure projects. The agreements are long-term workplace deals that cover the construction life of a major project. Most agreements now last 3 or 4 years, but major projects often go for longer. Industrial Relations Minister Michaelia Cash said there are currently 108 minerals projects across the country in pre-feasibility or feasibility stage, worth $47 billion, and the government doesn't want to jeopardise them. The AWU National Secretary Daniel Walton said there was no evidence that these agreements would help investment dollars flow. West Australians over the age of 30 will be able to get a COVID-19 vaccination from tomorrow, ahead of other states, though vaccinations are open to all residents over the age of 16 in the Northern Territory. Like the rest of the country, residents under the age of 50 get the Pfizer jab, while anyone over that age gets the AstraZeneca inoculation. In Victoria, genome testing has linked the West Melbourne mystery COVID-19 cluster to a hotel quarantine leak. That's good news in terms of controlling the virus. Just 2 new community-transmitted cases were recorded yesterday, with the city's lockdown scheduled to end tomorrow evening. Acting Premier James Merlino said lockdown restrictions would be eased gradually, but didn't give much more away. Meanwhile, the Therapeutic Goods Administration has said it is seriously concerned about misleading information in radio advertisements authorised by billionaire and former Member of Federal Parliament Clive Palmer. The TGA said the ads provided an incorrect picture of the safety of COVID-19 vaccines, adding that public figures had a responsibility to be factual and to not undermine health outcomes. Figures from the Australian Tax Office show that the proportion of landlords negatively gearing their properties fell below 60% for the first time on record as interest rates declined. The figures for the 2019 financial year show that 1.3 million of 2.2 million taxpayers owning at least one rental property declared it a net rental loss during that financial year. One of the highest profile defamation cases in recent years between war hero Ben Roberts-Smith and Nine Entertainment is in the federal court. The media group alleged Mr. Roberts-Smith committed murder on deployments to Afghanistan and that he punched his mistress in the face in Canberra. Mr. Roberts-Smith denies the allegations and says the reports portray him as a criminal. The media group is defending the defamation action on the basis of truth. The case has pitted Mr. Roberts-Smith against his former wife, and his lawyer, Bruce McClintock, has spent the past 2 days opening the case. He claims the allegations were sensational and false and had lost Mr. Roberts-Smith earnings and speaker engagements and a highly paid partnership with an accounting firm. The case is continuing. Santos and Boral will receive $50 million in new funding for carbon capture and storage projects. The federal government said the projects would help meet Australia's emissions reduction targets. Carbon capture is often criticised because it doesn't actually stop emissions escaping into the atmosphere, as clean projects do. But anything that gets it out of the air is okay with me. Qantas boss Alan Joyce is in a bit of hot water this morning after it emerged that he personally pushed for domestic flight crew to jump the vaccine queue. He wanted them in the same category as healthcare workers. His request was turned down. Macquarie Infrastructure will sell its US aviation business to private equity group KKR for $5.8 billion. The business, called Atlantic Aviation, offers hangar space, aircraft maintenance and other services. That's a pretty nice payday. Figures from research group Dealogic shows there's been more than $80 billion in mergers and acquisition deals announced so far in 2021, well above the average over the past 5 years. According to the Financial Review, it's the busiest year for deal makers in recent history. And in a near repeat of last week's news, Rock Partners has upped its bid for Vital Harvest for the 9th time, offering $1.33 a unit, more than the most recent offer from Macquarie Infrastructure and Real Assets. The bid was a 3.5% increase on Macquarie's, the biggest incremental increase since bidding began back in February. Up next is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Today I'm joined by Carlos Cacho, Chief Economist at Jarden Australia. I've spoken many times about the importance of the labour market. It's the most critical factor in our economic recovery. Carlos has done all the hard work in picking apart the weaknesses and strengths in the labour market. And best of all, he explains it incredibly clearly. Definitely worth a listen. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist. It's Wednesday, the 9th of June 2021. I'm Sean Aylmer, and that was Fear and Greed. Enjoy your day.